So we're moving on now with the last but not least presenters of our lecture portion of the plenary. Mon, if I could kindly request you to please display the introductory slide for Dr. Chris and Maridic Bernido. So as I mentioned, their CVs, their curriculum vitae are so voluminous that I, again, limited myself to just pointing out 3 or 4 of the essential or notable accomplishments that they have made or achieved. So here we go. So I just want to point out these accomplishments, but these are just, again, the tip of the icebergs. So they are President Chris, Dr. Chris, you are the president, and Dr. Marivic, she's the basic education directress of this institution that they co-founded, the Central Visayan Institute of Foundation, or CVIF, in Bohol. They both obtained their PhDs in theoretical physics and their masters in physics from the State University of New York, Albany, in the United States, and their bachelors in physics at the University of the Philippines, Diliman. So without further ado, I yield the floor to the two of you, please.
Hello, everyone. First of all, we'd like to thank Dr. Giselle Concepcion for her kind invitation for us to share some of our experiences and recommendations concerning education. We'll be talking about the CVIF Dynamic Learning Program, which has been shown to be an efficient, low-cost solutions for pandemic scenarios.
Let me talk about the outstanding questions during a pandemic. This would be the concerns of parents, of stakeholders, students, local government units, and so on. So a question would be, can students still learn well when there is a shelter-in-place advisory to slow down the spread of infection during a pandemic? Another question would be, can superior learning outcomes still be achieved even when there is no internet connectivity? This is especially true for countries like the Philippines, where there is very limited access to the internet. Is it necessary for parents to guide their children for their lessons? How about advanced topics? So I think parents would be concerned how they would be able to tutor or mentor their children if they're taking advanced algebra, calculus, chemistry, organic chemistry, and so on. Another question would be, can we bypass the worldwide lack of qualified STEM teachers in basic education? This problem was already present before the pandemic, and it's still now a burning issue at present. Are we taking advantage of new results from the neurosciences to improve education? And finally, especially for countries, many countries like the Philippines with limited budgets, is there a low-cost educational program that allows poorer nations to compete with budget-intensive educational systems of richer nations? Otherwise, if we will all be depending on big budget programs, then poorer nations will always be at a loss. Now, what we will be talking about this time would be the CVIF Dynamic Learning Program, which we conceptualized and implemented in 2002, so 18 years ago. The CVIF Dynamic Learning Program is a systems approach to process-induced learning. We call it process-induced learning, in contrast to teacher-induced learning, which is the more conventional approach. The Dynamic Learning Program, or DLP, also incorporates 21st century skills such as critical thinking, problem solving, collaboration, communication. And the program within the past 18 years has been applied at the elementary, secondary, and tertiary levels. So we have also written quite a few papers on the CVIF Dynamic Learning Program. Now, the DLP has core components or essential features, non-negotiable features, and Chris will talk about these.
to look at the details of the CVIF Dynamic Learning Program, or DLP for short. There are four pillars, four essential components which are actually non-negotiables. One will be the parallel learning homes, which is more or less automatic during lockdowns or when there is a shelter in place. And the importance of that is it automatically limits teacher intervention. The second component is the so-called activity-based learning by doing. And this involves the LAS, which is the Learning Activity Sheets. And you will see more of the LAS in a little while. The third component is that the students will have an in-house comprehensive portfolio where they file everything, quizzes, all the LAS, and so on. And very important also is strategic rest, which is needed by growing children or even adolescents or even adults. So let's start with the first component, which is the parallel learning homes. You can imagine the parallel learning homes wherein individual students will be with their families or with their brothers and sisters, and they will be doing the LAS, and there will be no teacher intervention when they are accomplishing the LAS. And in the CVIF DLP, tutoring by parents is not necessary. But after 1 week, once they accomplish a week-long set of activities, learning activities for all subjects, then this LAS will be collected so that they will be assessed by the subject teacher, by the expert teacher. Now, the second component is about this learning by doing through the learning activity sheets, or LAS. The structure of the LAS is relatively simple. It should be one concept, one page, and that should be contained in with font 14 in just one page of paper. And it starts with a short concept digest for whatever topic, for whatever year level. You have a short concept digest, followed by an example, an illustration, and then you end with a few questions. And the first question really has to be easy because we're also targeting even the challenged learners. So this LAS would then would lead towards the required competency. It could be the Department of Education, or we call it the DepEd. So the idea is that any complex task, whether calculus or physics or chemistry, can be divided into very small steps. And each step could even be further divided if you wish. And so these small steps will be copied by hand by the students. And the idea is that this collection of LAS would lead to whatever the Department of Education would require to the target competency. In the CVIF DLP, this learning activity sheets, we say that an ideal LAS, an ideal learning activity, is an LAS where zero intervention is needed. There's no lecture required. That's why it is immune to lockdowns, because lockdowns or shelter in place essentially mean that the teacher cannot be in contact with the students, especially if there is no internet connectivity. And by design, all LAS, no introductory lecture is required by design. And so the students will have to look at this new topic, and they will have to comprehend it, and it develops their critical thinking and problem solving abilities, and they try to answer it. They could commit a mistake, but at that stage, that's still formative learning, so it's okay to commit mistakes. Now, one of the key pillars in the CVIF DLP, which made it successful to our view, is that the students will copy by hand from the activity title to the learning target to the short concept digest, all the way to the answering the questions. And let me cite one paper, the Armenia. This paper is from a psychological science paper published by Mueller and Openheimer. And they said in the paper that note-taking with a pen rather than a laptop gives students a better grasp of the subject. So note-taking is superior than even keyboarding in a laptop. And this study, in fact, was focused on more than 300 students at Princeton and University of California, Los Angeles. The Mueller and Oppenheimer study demonstrated that students who write out their notes on paper actually learn more in each study. Those who wrote out their notes by hand had a stronger conceptual understanding and were more successful in applying and integrating the material than those who took notes with their laptops. Another earlier study, that's why we require that all the activities have to be copied and answered by hand, is that writing the activities activates both the psychomotor and visual faculties of the brain. Professor Hebb, long time ago, already said that neurons that fire together are wired together, while neurons that fire out of sync lose their link. So after writing all these learning activity sheets, the students, to teach them also organization, because organization is a treasured skill in the 21st century, they will compile it in a comprehensive student portfolio, which could be color-coded, like yellow could be science, white for math, blue for English, or whatever. So we are already telling you the different components. We started with the parallel learning homes. Then we talk about the learning by doing through the copying of the learning activities. And then we have the comprehensive portfolio. And strategic rest simply means that they should do nothing beyond the LAS, and whatever they do is already optional. So does this work? Well, actually, since 2002, we have been monitoring the framework of this dynamic learning program. And for example, 2-3 years ago, 25 students from our school passed the University of the Philippines college admission test. And this is, of course, the primary university in the Philippines based on rankings. And we'd like to note, and then followed by 27 students the year after, that CVIF is actually in a third-class municipality. It's way far from the nearest city. It's 63 kilometers from the nearest city. And the tuition is very low. In academic year 2019 to 2020, for junior high school, it's just 10,500 pesos for the whole year, and then 13,000 pesos for the whole year for senior high. CVIF is just a regular DepEd school. It's a mission school, and our admission is very liberal. And I suspect some of the students are even non-readers.
Maybe I would also just like to add that these students that was a pre-pandemic scenario. And at that time, strategic rest in the DLP consisted of the zero homework policy. So absolutely no homework for the students from their grade 7 till grade 12. And also we have 1 day a week, which would be for lighter subjects like PE, music, arts, health, or whatever. And so we had this number of students. Now a typical school in provincial areas like ours would only have maybe around 5 students who would pass if they're serious about it.
And there are a lot of performance indicators actually through the years. And some of the performance indicators are those that from the monitoring of students after they have gone through college and so on and so forth. So let me just show you an example. So we have a student, for example, Ronald Joren. He's now doing his PhD at ETH Zurich, and which is, of course, if you look at the QS ranking, it's #1 in the field that he entered, which is Earth and Marine Sciences. There is also Madeline Naiga, who is doing her PhD in physics in a joint program by Max Planck Institute and the University of Dresden. And another example would be Jesha Caseñas, who graduated BS Anthropology from the University of California, Berkeley. And so from the very beginning, our target has really been high. And the idea is that with minimum resources, if you have a very high target, then you compensate your lack of resources with a good strategy. And that's what we have been doing with the CVIF in Bohol. Yeah. So how about in a pandemic scenario? The features of the CVIF DLP is actually appropriate and very suitable in a pandemic scenario. So as we have mentioned, the key is really the learning activity sheets to be copied by hand by each student. And this could be distributed to the different houses, to the different students. If they have internet connectivity, then you can do this online. But if they don't have internet connectivity, then these learning activity sheets will be printed and distributed to the students through some designated drop-off points. It could be the school, some local government unit, and so on and so forth. So once these LAS are distributed, then the students, without teacher intervention, can work on them. Without teacher intervention, that's because it's by design the LAS were made like that. And during the week, while the students are doing the LAS, in the DLP, we actually allow them to communicate with each other. It's a peer tutoring is very, very strong in the dynamic learning program, and it teaches them collaboration and communication to achieve well-defined goals, because collaboration and communication is also a skill which we need to develop with the younger students. Now, a typical question that we receive is that during a pandemic, what is the guarantee that each student is learning? Well, the guarantee in the CVIF DLP is that each LAS is copied by hand and answered in the student's own handwriting, which involves the psychomotor, visual, and when read aloud, the hearing faculties of the brain. So unlike if you have, even if you're doing Zoom or MS Teams or Google Meet, you may be able to see the student on the screen, but you're not really sure whether the student is listening to you. But here, with the copying by hand, you're at least assured, there's a guarantee that they're learning. Another question is that as distance learning, how are learning outcomes assessed aside from tests? Learning is assessed by the weekly LAS that is collected and evaluated by the teachers. It's not like the usual mode wherein if you just give a midterm or final exams, and if the student fails, then it's too late, because by that time, the student has already wasted a month or two. But there are here weekly activities are assessed, and it could be also, the portfolios can also be graded in terms of completeness, neatness, and so on. So just to contrast between a pandemic scenario and the conventional method, in the CVIF DLP, that's the figure on the left. So the LAS is distributed whether online or printed and drop-off points. And then the students will be working on them without teacher intervention. And no introductory lecture is required for each LAS. And then they will be collected in the same way that they were distributed. And they will be assessed weekly. Unlike in the conventional method, they have these modules, and they do a lot of teacher training to train the teachers how to do the distance learning. And if these modules are the type of modules that requires teacher lectures, then we are afraid that this might not give a good result. We note that for decades, modules and books have already been given to the students, and plus the lectures, the response or the outcome was not really that good, especially in the Philippines. So maybe to summarize briefly, the CVIF dynamic learning, it addresses learner disposition because it's habit forming. They do the daily protocol at home. And it could also address the lack of qualified STEM teachers, because as long as you have these learning activity sheets, and because it's independent of the teachers, then you can actually bypass, especially in the STEM subjects, this lack of qualified teachers. So the CVIF DLP bypasses severely limited face-to-face learning modes, especially in a pandemic scenario. It could bypass the lack of internet connectivity. It could bypass the worldwide lack of qualified STEM teachers. And it's actually very cheap that any nation on earth could implement it without much budget. So the high performance outcomes for Filipino youth can be achieved even during this pandemic with no additional foreign loans or extra budget that we can actually use for health services instead. For more details, you can look at this website. So let's go back to our questions, which we started at the beginning.
Yeah, can students learn well when there is a shelter in place advisory to slow down the spread of infection, especially during times of a pandemic? And we say yes. And of course, in many advanced countries, they would say, of course, we have online learning. But what about situations where online learning is not possible? There are even places where there is no electricity in the homes of some students, some of our students in our school, for example. So the next question is, can superior learning outcomes still be achieved even with no internet connectivity? And our answer again is yes. It can be done with our dynamic learning program. It has been tested during calamities such as earthquakes, floods in Cagayan de Oro, Yolanda in Tacloban, and all these calamities. Next is it necessary for parents to guide their children in their lessons? How about advanced topics? And our answer is no. This is a serious concern of parents. There are many parents who would hesitate very much to tutor their children in their algebra lessons, chemistry, physics, and other more challenging subjects. So we say, parents, you may relax. You don't need to tutor or mentor your children. Can we bypass the worldwide lack of qualified STEM teachers in basic education, which is a question pre-pandemic, during a pandemic, and after the pandemic? It's still a serious issue, and our answer is yes. We have a program where we can bypass the lack of qualified STEM teachers. Are we taking advantage of new results from neuroscience to improve education? Yes, there are many results of research nowadays. We just don't have time to go into the details of that. And is there a low-cost educational program that allows poorer nations to compete with budget-intensive educational systems of richer nations? And we say yes. Poverty is not an excuse for mediocre academic performance. We believe strongly, and it can be done. We believe that even those with a shoestring budget can still achieve very high performance outcomes for their learners.
So after having answered those questions, I'd like to thank some people who created the learning activity sheets, or LAS, especially at the senior high school level, through the help of the science core. Let me start with Dr. Benjamin Rubin. He got his PhD from the University of California, San Diego, but currently a postdoc at Berkeley. And another fellow is Dr. Hyunjin Shim. She got her PhD from École Polytechnique de Lausanne in Switzerland, but currently now a postdoc at Berkeley. And of course, Dr. Victor Soho, he was the one who created the website eduversum.org. He got his PhD from University College London and then postdoc at the LMU in Munich. And lastly, the most recent fellow was Dr. Hyun Dog Shin, who graduated from MIT. And they all created the LAS, which are actually available for free anywhere in the world. So just go to the website. And
It's still a new website. It's still under construction, but there are already a lot of LAS uploaded in the website. Chemistry, biology, programming.
Yes. And if you want to know how to create an LAS, just go to this website. Let us end. We'd like to end with a thank you note, especially to Professor Baldomero Oliveira of University of Utah for connecting us with the Science Corps and their fellows who are doing and creating the LAS. And most especially, we'd like to thank Professor Baldomero for his outreach program to our school, especially in the marine biodiversity aspect. He comes to Bohol often, Cebu and Bohol, and we see each other there. So hopefully after the pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you to all.
Thank you both very much, Dr. Chris and Maribik Bernidos, for this very insightful presentation. I really commend the two of you for, not only focusing, but also for bringing attention to the critical importance of learning methodologies and pedagogies to be able to maximize and optimize learning outcomes, particularly for young people in developing economies. But in reality, what you're designing is applicable not only to emerging economies, but even to developed economies, particularly here in the United States as well. Well, there's a big challenge in public primary and secondary schools as well. So I'm really intrigued and inspired by your dynamic learning program approach. This really is an example of disruptive innovation applied to education. So, and I'm very intrigued by your learning activity sheets, which at times do not involve any intervention by instructors or teachers, which makes it really adaptable to, particularly in this time of pandemic, where people are quarantined and staying at home. But my one quick question for you is, and you talked about this in terms of assessing regularly, perhaps on a weekly basis, the learning activity sheets that the students produce. In terms of critical thinking, assessing the critical thinking of the students, what sort of metrics or variables do you consider in doing that assessment for the learning sheets?
Yeah, well, it will depend now on the design of the activity sheet, the questions and exercises at the end, after they read the concept digest and follow the example, the illustrations. They normally have to answer questions, do exercises, do problem solving. So it would partially depend on the design of that. And of course, following DepEd, we do have paper and pen tests also. And that would be a tangible measure of how far they are able to develop their critical thinking skills. Of course, it's only partial. We don't say 100%, but it is already a good measure.
Right. That makes sense. And I really think that the name that you provided, Dynamic Learning Program, I think that's quite apropos to describe your pedagogy. And I think it makes it fun for the students because they're learning dynamically on their own. And that is a very big step in terms of lifetime learning. So thank you very much indeed. Thank you. We appreciate your contribution. So this concludes part one, which, by the way, we're making good time. We're on time, the first 2 hours of this plenary session. I'd like to thank again every one of our distinguished lecturers for this plenary session.